Good afternoon. My name is Tanya Smith, and I'm the Community Relations Coordinator with Gift of Life Michigan. Today, we're going to continue our conversation on our Let's Talk series, What Happens After I Join the Organ Donor Registry? Part 2. At Gift of Life, our mission is to honor life through donation. We have the privilege and responsibility of coordinating end-of-life organ and tissue donations for our state. We also have partners in this life-saving mission. Today, we will hear from Kimberly Usolini with United Network for Organ Sharing. The United Network for Organ Sharing is a private, nonprofit organization that manages the U.S. organ transplant system under contract with the federal government. But before we hear from Kim, let's view a short video produced by United Network for Organ Sharing, explaining the organ donation process.
Organ donation and transplantation is a complex process requiring the expertise and collaboration of thousands every day. The intricate journey begins with the generosity of one person, the organ donor. Organ donors are hospitalized patients on ventilators whose brains or hearts have stopped functioning, often due to a tragic injury, but whose organs are still viable. After exhausting all means to save the patient's life, the hospital contacts their Organ Procurement Organization, or OPO. OPO staff are trained to counsel patients' families at the worst moment of their lives. If the patient is a registered organ donor, the OPO helps the family understand the process they're about to go through. If the patient is not registered, the OPO offers the family the option to donate. This is a transformative decision. A single donor can save up to 8 lives. Eye and tissue donors can heal even more. Once authorization is obtained, the OPO begins working to match the organ with a critically ill patient. Currently, more than 100,000 patients are on the national waiting list, maintained by the United Network for Organ Sharing, or UNOS. OPO staff first determine if the donor's organs are viable for transplant, and then enters their medical information into the UNOS database, which generates a list of best matches based on a variety of clinical factors. The OPO contacts the transplant hospitals of matched patients, where doctors will determine if the donated organ is right for their patient. Once an organ has been accepted, the clock starts ticking, because organs remain viable outside the body for only a short time. The organs are then respectfully recovered from the generous donor. The OPO arranges to transport the donated organ to the transplant hospital to help a patient in need. Once the medical team transplants the organ, a life is saved. A donor, a willing family, and life-saving organs are essential to the transplant journey. It takes place 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
Our presenter today is Kimberly Usolini. Kim has worked in organ donation and transplant for almost 10 years and 7 years with United Network for Organ Sharing. Kim has recently promoted to a managerial role in the Policy and Community Relations Department. She also has experience in hospital development, compliance, policy development, community outreach and engagement, professional education, quality and process improvement, data quality, and data governance. She recently earned a credential as a certified professional in healthcare quality. Kim has a bachelor's degree in journalism with concentration in public health, a master's degree in health communication with a focus in advocacy, and a master's degree in public health with a specialization in health policy. Kim is also a kidney transplant recipient, having received her life-saving transplant in 1989. In her spare time, Kim enjoys spending time with her husband, her 2 young daughters, trips to the beach, and reading. Kim, I've been with Gift of Life for almost 6 years, and I can say I still have a lot to learn. So I'm extremely excited about this presentation and look forward to gaining more knowledge from you regarding how United Network for organ sharing helps us honor life through donation. So guests, during Kim's presentation, we'd like to hear from you. Please share your thoughts and add your questions below. Kim?
Tanya, thank you so much. And thank you to the Gift of Life for inviting me to share a little bit more about how the matching function works and what does happen after the OPO gets involved in organ donation. So I have control of my slides. There we go. So just to ground us in the United Network for Organ Sharing mission and vision. All the work that we do around our core functions of policy development, data, and compliance and monitoring is really to unite and strengthen the donation and transplant community to save lives. So we really consider ourselves conveners. We aren't necessarily the subject matter experts, but our skill set and our access allows us to find those SMEs and convene them to really solve problems that the donation and transplant communities are facing. Our vision is probably very much aligned with Gift of Life, a life-saving transplant for every patient in need. That's just to ground us in sort of the background and the work that we do. So a little history lesson. So UNOS was formed or originated via another organization called the Southeastern Organ Procurement Foundation, which was located in Richmond, Virginia, where we are still located today. So back in 1977, CEOP, as we call it, developed a computerized database, if you can believe it, back then in the 70s, that allowed each of its member institutions, so member institutions being transplant hospitals, to list candidates and then help those hospitals find candidates in case they didn't have someone within their own institution to match an organ to. So a few years later, in 1982, we launched a call center to, again, further facilitate the process. And in 1984, Congress passed, I apologize for the typos, the National Organ Transplant Act, or NOTA, calling for the OPTN, or the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network, the formation of that entity, to be created and run by a private nonprofit organization under federal contract. So Tanya touched on some of those descriptors when she introduced UNOS. In 1986, UNOS was awarded the initial OPTN contract with the federal government to develop the requirements for the operation of the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network. And we have served as the OPTN ever since. I think we just celebrated 30 plus years very recently, so we have been very fortunate. All right. So what does the contract with the federal government stipulate, or what does it require UNOS to do as the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network? So first, the OPTN is charged with establishing an organ sharing system that maximizes the efficient use of deceased organs through equitable and timely allocation. We'll talk a little bit more about that in subsequent slides. We are charged with establishing a system to collect, store, analyze, and publish data pertaining to the donation and transplantation system. So that covers listing patients on the wait list, organ matching, and then transplants. And then we also collect follow-up data for as long as a transplant program can track that patient. Finally, we need to ensure that there's informed, consulted, and guided persons and organizations concerned with human organ transplantation in order to increase the number of organs available for transplant. So we engage members of what we call the donation and transplantation community, which covers everyone from the candidate waiting for an organ, their caregivers, donor family members, the patient throughout the life cycle of the transplant process. So when they come out the other end as a recipient, we also engage transplant physicians and surgeons across all organs, histocompatibility specialists, transplant coordinators, transplant administrators, scientific organization that have an interest in organ donation and transplantation. So it's really a wide spectrum of folks that we engage in this process. So let's touch a little bit on what factors are considered when organs are allocated. So in addition to probably the more obvious things like biological and medical factors, which if you go to unos.org and you access our page on how organs are placed, it kind of covers what factors are important for each organ. I'm not going to cover it in that level of detail today. But we also consider ethical principles. And two of the ones that are sort of at the forefront are justice and medical utility or utility. So utility is when demand exceeds supply. Organs, we think, should be allocated to patients who have the best chance of survival. That's one principle, one grounding sort of ethical construct that we consider when we are developing organ policy. And then justice, hopping back up there to the top, is sort of more or less all things created equal. So all candidates, when considering this principle, should accept both the benefits and the burdens of the organ transplant or the organ allocation system. And so things like how long a patient has been on the waiting list, or those in most urgent need should be considered, at maybe a higher level. Should organs go to those folks first? Organ allocation is a balance of these things. So justice doesn't always prevail, and utility doesn't always prevail. But we try to weigh these things because they kind of play out a little bit differently, depending on the organ that's in need. So I am not an ethicist by any means. So if you folks have any questions about that, I'm happy to get that answered by someone who knows far more than I do. So as we segue into what happens after you join the registry. So once contacted with a potential donor, the video covered a lot of this, but to emphasize that OPO staff conduct a thorough medical and social history of the potential donor to help determine the suitability of organs for transplant. OPO staff work with hospital staff to offer the option of donation to the donor family if they're not on the registry. And they also, they're also going in and accessing that state registry to ensure or to check whether that donor is already on there, has already expressed their desire to become an organ donor, or they're in conversations with the family and maybe they didn't list or sign up on the registry, but they clearly made their desire known to family. OPO staff is also responsible for the clinical care of the donor once consent for donation is obtained. They enter that information into the UNOS computer system so the computer system can find a match for those donated organs. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, on the next slide. And then after that match is made, the OPO staff has a huge responsibility for supporting that donor while organs are being allocated, which can sometimes take a very long time. And then coordinating that organ recovery process with surgical teams, sometimes from different states, and providing follow-up information so those surgeons and medical teams can make the appropriate decision on whether that organ is right for that candidate. All right, so I apologize that this graphic is a little hard to read, at least the language. So this is sort of a visual depiction of sort of the process in action. From the top there is sort of the candidate who needs an organ, right? So their transplant program evaluates them, determines that they are a good transplant. They list the patient in our system called waitlist. And then that patient, depending on, the organ they need, starts accruing waiting time. And then there on the bottom, in parallel, at times, you have a potential donor who dies in a hospital on a ventilator, as the presentation said. That the donor hospital will refer that potential donor to their local organ procurement organization. And then after a variety of other steps, it's determined that that potential donor can actually donate their organs, which is great. So we have the candidate data inputted into waitlist. We have donor data inputted into a system called DonorNet. And the match, is, as we call it, takes that information, the information from both systems, and is weighing all different kinds of factors. And if you're asking, well, how does that computer algorithm know, which candidate might be suitable for those donor organs? The algorithm is just computer programming, right? So it needs rules to react to, so it knows how to order patients. And those rules come from policy developed by the subject matter experts and members of the donation transplant community that I shared earlier, from patients to the medical teams to coordinators, et cetera. And so that is the match run. And we're going to talk a little bit about the wait list on, I think, the next slide. But it's not actually a list. There is no single list. It's very much a dynamic process. So again, we'll go a little bit deeper on the next slide. So once the match run is generated, the computer system sends out a blast offer to candidates who would be eligible and potentially match with those with that donor. Any candidate who is deemed incompatible for any number of reasons, maybe it's blood type, or other biological factors. Maybe it's a height mismatch or a weight mismatch. The transplant hospital who lists the patients is putting in those criteria. So all those patients that the system recognizes would not be eligible to receive this donor organ based on the information that the transplant hospital puts in are screened off of those offers. Medical teams at the transplant hospital where the patient is listed are evaluating those offers as they come in 24 hours a day. Once they evaluate and determine, yes, this looks like a great organ for my this specific candidate, they will accept the organ offer. The OPO team will work with the surgical teams who will come in and recover the various organs. They will arrange transportation, as the video touched on. The transplant occurs, and then the transplant program is responsible for following those patients and ensuring that the organ is still functioning and that the patient has a good quality of life, and that a variety of other things are still functioning very well for that recipient. As a recipient myself, I can attest I'm still going to a transplant program twice a year to get my follow-up appointments and ensure that that the kidney is still functioning. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the wait list. So as I mentioned, there is no national wait list. Transplant programs, maintain lists, for their purposes. But every time a match is generated, it's sort of like shuffling a deck of cards. So not every candidate is going to be a perfect match for, an available organ at the time of that match is run. And so the algorithm, if you will, or the match is reshuffling that deck every time an OPO indicates that they have an organ donor that has organs to be offered. So think of it sort of like that rather than an actual static list like your grocery list. Here it describes it sort of as a pool, if you will, but I kind of like the card analogy a little bit better. So that's kind of how it works. And I apologize, I didn't advance the slide there. So I think shuffling the deck of cards, again, is a slightly better analogy than the pool analogy described here. But again, it's dynamic. It changes every time a match offer is made. There is no static list. So again, kind of circling back to policies, and those policies, again, are the rules that inform how organs are allocated and how our computer systems will match organs with candidates and donors. You can see here some of the things that are considered patient and donor family issues, medical issues specific to various organ types, disease processes. We consider the needs and concerns of minority populations. So that might include race, ethnicity, but also includes populations such as peds, highly sensitized candidates, et cetera. The technical and geographical aspects of organ recovery and matching. So although things are changing, there was a point in time where if an organ was donated in Alaska, it probably was not going to make it to a transplant candidate in North Carolina, for example. But if you follow the news, that's actually has happened relatively recently. So technology is amazing, really changing the way that whole system works. Ethical principles, as I touched on already, and then what data do we need to collect to ensure that we have the right information to make those matches, and then to monitor things like patient safety and post-transplant outcomes, et cetera. And if you didn't see any of the news bites earlier this year, this was the first year that this country, our transplant system, surpassed 40,000 organ transplants. And so that is a result of the work of Gift of Life, of course, the generosity of our donor families, and a variety of different professionals who contribute to this work. So that is my presentation. And if there are any questions, I am happy to try and answer them.
Kim, thank you so very much for your very detailed presentation. It was fabulous. We do have a comment from a Facebook user. They say they were a double lung transplant back in 2005.
Awesome.
And they're internally grateful to their anonymous donor. I'm sure they voiced the opinion for a lot of people who have been blessed to receive a transplant. We also have, there was a question in the chat when you were talking about Gift of Life contacting United Network. Can you share what information is entered into the system? You said information is entered into the system. What type of information is entered?
Lots of information. So the OPO is entering everything from the blood type of the donor, the height and weight of the donor. Visualizing in my head the number of fields within DonorNet is sort of a little bit overwhelming. So it's any and all information that would help, that just sort of describes the donor, right? Like I said, height, weight, blood type, if the donor has, any history of disease, and a lot of the social and medical history that I believe was mentioned earlier is also entered in there. And then any medical information that would help surgical teams and the medical teams, evaluating, those organs for their candidates, make a decision. So while the OPO is supporting the donor during this sometimes very long process, that donor is being supported in the same way that hospitals would support someone when they are trying to save their lives. So that donor is getting, fluids, and they are getting medications, and they are being supported in the same way as a live patient would be supported. Because what's good for, eventually those organs are going into a live patient, right? So you wouldn't stop supporting, a donor just because they're deceased, right? You need to support the viability of those organs. So it's a lot of medical information, sort of in short, information that's going to help medical teams make a decision about that organ for their candidate. Is sort of the short and sweet of it, but it is a lot of data, a lot.
So the data's entered, and so the person that's entering the data presses enter, and I envision a list of people that potentially would match this particular organ pop up.
Yes. So again, visualizing what it looks like in my head. So, yep, after the OPO has inputted all of that information as completely and accurately as, what they know at that time, at the point in time that they enter it, they'll hit run match, I believe is what the button is called. And it takes the system a couple seconds, depending on the organ, to generate a list of candidates. If it's a very short list for sort of multivisceral or intestines, that's a very quick match run, what we call it, match run. If it's a kidney offer, that can take several seconds, to run. And so, yes, what the OPO will see is they'll see sort of a snapshot of, some very basic information about the donor at the top of DonorNet. And then they will see a list of candidates in rank order for what the system recognizes to be the rules for organ allocation for that system.
Okay, cool.
And that's also based on the data or the information that the transplant hospital is putting in for the candidate. So it's very important for the hospital to maintain accurate information so that at that snapshot in time, the information gels and they can align and ensure that, the candidate isn't ineligible to receive an organ at that time, for example. So.
Okay. Just a couple questions, and we'll end the segment. There was a question from Carolyn Hart. Are you upload? Okay. What information do you give the donor family after the gift is made?
So UNOS doesn't share that information. That would be the OPO. And I think OPOs generally share, and Tanya, jump in if you all at Gift of Life do otherwise, but the age and sex of the recipient, sometimes what organs they were able to receive. I used to work at an OPO, so I know what information we shared, but it might vary by OPO, but very limited information. UNOS doesn't share any information. That usually comes via the OPO.
Okay. One last question. So how has COVID affected what you do?
Awesome question.
Yeah.
Awesome question. So if we rewind 2 years ago, 2020, so March 2020, things were getting, a little bit, things started closing in, I think, on us as a country, us as a world, right? So I remember the day that UNOS was going to trial sort of a work from home situation. And the very next day, essentially the country shut down. And so what we saw were, again, we saw this in the data, we heard it from the community and the folks that we work with out in the community. Any elective surgeries, such as living donor donations, which I guess a lot of hospitals consider to be elective, those were shut down, put on hold. A lot of transplant programs were not doing those surgeries. What else did we see? We enacted a few emergency policies that would relieve transplant programs from entering data or bringing candidates and recipients and living donors in for follow-up, for example, for follow-up appointments and entering data, because there are some requirements in policy that certain data needs to be updated, according to certain timeframes. But if you don't want to bring your immunocompromised recipients in for follow-up appointments, or your living donors, or even your candidates in, we passed some emergency policies to sort of alleviate some of those requirements, dial them back a little bit. We started issuing, I believe it was a weekly COVID email to the transplant community, just keeping them kind of up to date on data. What were the transplant trends throughout the pandemic? We actually, I believe, put a dashboard on our website where folks could go and look at that information. The emergency policies, as I mentioned, we developed some patient resources that transplant programs could share with their patients. Those were posted on our, I think it was a COVID resource page. So we acted rather quickly, I would say in a more agile fashion than we typically do when we're developing policy and we're trying to do our due diligence to consider all angles. Out of concern for the community, to try to relieve burden on the community in terms of, data entry and that sort of thing, and to ensure patient safety first and foremost. So those were a few of the things that we did. And I believe on the unos.org site, you can still find that COVID page and read through some of the other things that we did.
Thank you so much, Kim. We very much appreciate you coming on and sharing a wealth of information about how you as a partner can help us save lives in the community. So we appreciate you very much. And Carolyn Hart, there's some additional information regarding what we do at Gift of Life based on the question that you were requesting. So take a look at that. And so to our viewers and audience, thank you so much for your time today. Please like our social media pages on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and learn more about our upcoming events. We do have a symposium coming up, Mental Health Matters in Transplantation, the Healing of the Mind and Body. March 17th is virtual. And we're partnering with Children's Hospital as well as Wayne State University. Those of you that may be physicians, psychologists, nurses, social workers, chaplains, students, you have the opportunity to earn at least 7.5 continuing education credits. So just go out on our Facebook page or Instagram and LinkedIn, and you should be able to find our flyer and register. That ends our programming for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.